I think that connecting consciousness to feeling, I think, is essential. The fact that this is about life, is about life inside a body and about regulation of that life. And that feeling is a beautiful development that helps us regulate that life. I think this is absolutely critical.
Welcome to Brain Science, the podcast where we explore how recent discoveries in neuroscience are unraveling the mystery of how our brain makes us human. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and this is episode 189. This month, I'm talking with Dr. Antonio Damasio about his new book, Feeling and Knowing. If you are new to brain science, you should know that I call Brain Science the podcast for everyone who has a brain because my goal is to provide accurate science in a way that is accessible to everyone. You can find more episodes of Brain Science at brainsciencepodcast.com, and you can email me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. Brain Science comes out the fourth Friday of each month, and you can get show notes automatically if you sign up for our free newsletter. Just text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. That's Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. I'll be back after the interview to review the key ideas, so please listen all the way to the end. Antonio Damasio, it's great to finally have you on Brain Science. I don't know if you remember, about 10 years ago, we tried to get together and fell through. It was around the time Self Comes to Mind was published.
Yep, that would be 10 years ago, exactly.
Yeah. Even though we've had all these obstacles, it seems like just the way it is. As a practicing neurologist, I know you have firsthand knowledge of the importance of consciousness, and many of my listeners are familiar with your previous books, including Self Comes to Mind, which I ended up discussing in episode 81, even though you weren't able to come on the show. So I was hoping that before we talk about your new book, we could talk just a little bit about your own personal journey. How did you end up both becoming a neurologist and having the fascination with the role of feeling and consciousness, all that?
Well, how I ended up becoming a neurologist is easy to think about. When I decided to go to medical school, I was already extremely interested in the mental aspects of humanity. And I thought at first that maybe I wouldn't become a psychiatrist because I was interested in what was going on in the normal mind, so-called normal mind, and minds with problems. But very soon I realized that the psychiatry, at least at that time, was not giving us the right answers, and that the possibility of understanding what was going on would be enhanced if I would really know something about the nervous system. And so that's really what made me switch in the direction of the nervous system, but always with my concern for mind. Prior to going to medical school, I probably thought for a time if I wanted to be a physician or if I wanted to be a writer. I was very interested in writing, not in writing per se, but in writing about people, in trying to understand people and their problems. So I think there was this mixture of motivations, understanding human beings, trying to see about their problems, the problems that are normally described as mental problems, and then this desire to do something that would really have explanatory power and would relate to the reality of a nervous system. Now, it's quite interesting. My giving this answer to you makes me think that one of the things that is very important in my current thinking, and which, by the way, the new book, Feeling and Knowing, expresses very intensely, is that knowing about the nervous system alone is not a way to explain minds. Minds are much more than about the nervous system, and they are actually, quite importantly, about the body. In which there is a nervous system and inside which there is a mind operating. So I think in a new book, interesting statements such as the idea that you can explain mind by solely relying on the nervous system is false, although it tends to be the idea that is put forward by most people that work in neuroscience, whether they work in neuroscience alone or in neuroscience psychology or in neurology or even in the philosophy of mind. There's this obsession with the nervous system, which is, of course, understandable because you certainly cannot do it without the nervous system. But the idea that it is the nervous system that provides the solution is very false. Again, that links with something that, as you know, is a passion of mine, which is feeling, and which I have very boldly stated in the title of my new book, is that feeling, again, is supposed to be understandable in terms of the brain alone. And of course, that's not true. And feeling of all the aspects of the human mind that we could tackle, feeling is through and through about the body. And I would say, just to get things started in the right way, about this deep interaction and commingling of mind and body. And that is not the case when you're dealing with external perception. When you're dealing with what goes on in the world of vision or hearing, it's something different. When we talk about feeling, we're talking about something that is really internal and totally related to this organism inside of which we do have a nervous system.
That's a great start and exactly what I had in mind. Do you want to just give us maybe an overview of feeling and knowing and talk a little bit about how it's different from your previous books?
Well, quite interesting. It's the first book that I write that I would call manageable in terms of size. My books tend to be longish, some very longish, and have tons of pages of notes and references. And this one does have quite a lot of notes and references, but it is far more brief. I think there are 48 sections that are sort of mini essays on all these topics that relate to feeling, that relate to consciousness, that relate to the mind in general. And I tried to have bold, pointed definitions of these processes and try not to go too long so as not to let the reader meander and be confused. I wanted to simplify as much as possible. This actually was the idea of writing a book this way was not mine, was an idea that came from my editor, Dan Frank at Pantheon, who has worked with me for many years. And he said, you need to write a book that lots of people can read and understand without having too much of a background. And I thought that I had been doing that in part at least, but he didn't think so. So that's why Feeling and Knowing came to be. And now that I've read it again, after finishing it, I've read it now in French, in Portuguese, in English, of course, in Spanish, and I'm liking it. I just came back from Paris, and I was flying back 2 days ago, and I was reading the English version again, and I was telling my wife next to me, this is actually a good book. I like this. This guy writes well.
I'm glad you're pleased. A lot of my listeners have read some of your previous work. So would you talk a little bit about how your ideas have evolved and changed?
My first book was called Descartes Sarah, a rather bold title that I was a little embarrassed to use. But that was actually the right title because it talked about a conventional view of what Descartes would have said. And this idea, which is highly exaggerated, that Descartes would have separated body and mind forever. But that book was actually about decision-making. It was about the fact that when we are constantly making decisions in our day-to-day life, whether they're simple or complicated, those decisions have actually a lot to do with what is going on in the life of affect, in our affects, sometimes specifically with emotions, sometimes with feelings. Two things are different, but there's this huge influence of the world of affect in how we decide what we do, whether simple or complicated, whether it's about getting married or doing investments, or simply decided if you're going to have tea or coffee. So the world of affect is there in the background, and sometimes is there even in the foreground, having a huge amount of influence in how you decide. And the idea there was to let's not believe for a second that this is all about reason, knowing things and being able to have an algorithm that gives you the solution. It's more complicated than that. And this fundamental life of the body, this fundamental life of life, the fact that we are alive and that our life can be well regulated or poorly regulated, and that we may be feeling well or not so well, has a huge role to play in our decisions in our daily life.
Did you get that idea from working with patients, or did that really come when you got to I think the first book I read was the second one, The Feeling of What Happens?
It's interesting. No, the idea did not come from studying patients, although it got shape from the study of patients. So I think I had the idea first from observations of life, from reflecting on life, but then observing patients, and especially observing patients that had lost the ability to have affect influence their decisions. That had a huge role. It sort of convinced me that I was on the right track. And then it led to a very long experimental program in which we had all sorts of experiments on decision making in both individuals that were neurologically intact and individuals that had brain lesions in different parts of the brain. That was really the beginning of this whole program. Then other books dealt a little bit with, again, my interest in Descartes, but deeper, and my interest in Spinoza, who in a way is a philosopher whose ideas are different, but a person that is very much aware of his body, very much aware of how body and feelings and emotions play a role in the day-to-day. I liked to have that opportunity of writing about people that I admired from what I had read, and that had something quite important to do with what I was doing scientifically.
And William James?
Nice guy. No, William James would certainly be on the list of my heroes, my intellectual heroes, and I have quite a bunch of them. Both the ones from the long ago past and the ones that were heroes and that I got the chance of knowing personally, which is very important to me too.
I want to take a moment to thank TextExpander for continuing to sponsor Brain Science. I love having them as a sponsor because I literally use TextExpander every day. With TextExpander, you can create snippets for any content you want to reuse, which is an incredible way to reduce keyboard fatigue. Best of all, it's available on all platforms, including iOS, iPad, Android, and Windows, so you can use it on every device. To get 20% off your first year, go to textexpander.com/podcast to learn more. And don't forget to tell them that you heard about it on Brain Science. One of the things you did talk about in this book that was new to me was this idea of the difference between explicit and non-explicit cognition.
That's a very important idea. And by the way, in a previous book, I elaborated quite a lot on it. That's The Strange Order of Things, which is, I think, 2018. And in that book, which actually contains my updated view on consciousness and the relation to feeling, and quite a lot about simpler creatures like bacteria, for example, and lots of creatures without nervous systems. I make that distinction. So it's clear that even creatures that have one single cell, that don't even have a nucleus, like bacteria, have a very complex life, and a life in which there are a lot of smarts. To say that they decide is a little bit abusive, because I don't think they have a mind. So the decision, in the sense in which we normally talk about it, doesn't make any sense. But the fact is that they behave intelligently. In relation to what? In relation to being, for example, if they are in a place that is too hot and the increase in temperature would threaten the homeostasis of that little body, the regulation of life within that body, guess what? They'll move to a place that is less hot. And if they are in a place that has no nourishment available, they will move to a place where there will be some nourishment. So there are all of these quote unquote decisions that are being made by these very simple organisms. They have to rely on is implicit. It's not explicit at all. There are no expressed in images or reasonings, but it's there guiding the process in a way that I like to call covert or implicit, and guides them very efficiently. And this is really quite remarkable. And if anybody is very, say, for example, why on earth is Damasio not concerned with the nervous system, and why on earth is he giving so much power to the body? My answer would be just look at what bacteria do. There's absolutely nothing that resembles the nervous system, and there will not be for millions of years, and yet they're doing things that are intelligent and that will save their lives. All of that is coming out of the body itself and the regulatory capacities of that body, and not out of this thing that we have glorified called the nervous system.
You point out in the book that from an evolutionary point of view, nervous systems are fairly recent. So why is that so important?
For a variety of reasons. One is that it tells you that life itself and its regulatory apparatus was smart to begin with, was clearly devoted, if we can use that word, to the maintenance of life within the limits that would be possible, within the limits that were available, in fact. And the goal was to maintain life for as long as that body would last, which is something that we know now is being determined largely by genetic systems. So maintain life in the best possible arrangement, because if it's not in a good arrangement, there's going to be sickness, there's going to be disease, there's going to be death. If it works too well, there may be dissipation and disease as well. So it's finding a way in which life can operate reasonably well and can be maintained for a certain period of time that is usually prescribed in the genetics of a particular organism. And so that is already there prior to the appearance of nervous systems. And my idea, as I explain in Feeling and Knowing, is that this was already there. And guess what? Nervous systems, rather than being the first producers and purveyors of that capacity, are already being developed and evolved with that capacity as a goal. So the nervous systems don't appear and don't evolve to make well-regulated life possible. They appear and evolve to make life even better regulated than during the period in which there were no nervous systems. Let's call it an upgrade. An upgrade has very important consequences, but it is not the original design. The original design is already there, allowing life to be maintained and to be adjusted with quite a lot of ease, but within a smaller niche.
You also wrote that the nervous system is not enough to create mental experience. We need it, but it's not enough. So is the thing that we need besides the nervous system, I'm guessing from everything you've said so far, it is the body.
Yes, it is the body in all its aspects. And it is very fundamentally this sort of inaugural event in the world of consciousness and eventually in the world of knowing, which is feeling our own conditions of life. What is beautiful about feeling is that, remember, when we talked about bacteria, you can perfectly imagine bacteria in a setting where there would be little nourishment and there would be the wrong temperature, there would be all sorts of threats. And there's only so much that organism would be able to regulate because it's dependent not on its own intelligence and its decisions, but on the way it's made and the environment that it is in. Once there is the development of feeling, which for me is really the beginning of the development of consciousness, something quite miraculous happens. Is that now, whether things in your life are going well or not so well, when you have well-being, a feeling that we all want to have, the information that feeling is giving you is quite clear. Things are going well, stay the way you are, don't jitter too much. On the other hand, if you suddenly feel malaise, if you're feeling sick, that feeling is telling you something very important. And more even than telling you something important, is allowing you to do something about the condition you find yourself in. If you find yourself sick, if you find yourself in pain, you have the possibility of doing something about it. So that's the introduction of the new means of regulation of life. Creatures without nervous systems and without the possibility of feeling have to make do with their implicit covert capacities.
So they can't have explicit cognition.
Exactly. Whereas we, endowed with feelings, know whether things are going well or not in our body, in the life within our body, and we can do something about it. So if you're hungry, you can go eat. And if you're thirsty, which I happen to be right now, you can drink. And if you are in a place that is unbearably hot, you can move to a colder climate. All of those things are possible because of this amazing inaugural event, which is giving you straightforward information about the state of life in your body.
Antonio, I'd like to go through a couple of definitions because they really help to clarify your key ideas. Would you start out by just defining how you use the word mind?
Mind. Mind for me is a collection of images that are occurring continuously in time, and they have a sequence. I like to describe it as cortege. It's a march of different images that are based on neural maps. Whenever you say the word image, the tendency is for people to imagine pictures. But it's not just pictures in the visual sense. For example, you're having a continuous flow of images that are auditory in your mind that correspond to the sounds of my voice articulating right now. But you could be listening to music and you would have this procession of auditory images. And the same thing happens when you touch things or when you have smells and tastes and so forth. So minds are, to me, strictly about these successions of images that are generated by a variety of components of the nervous system, whose business it is to generate a map of a certain landscape. Whether the landscape is auditory or visual or tactile, that's nor here nor there. You generate those maps. Those maps are converted in the appropriate structures of the nervous system, namely cerebral cortices, are converted into these images, and mind is about that. And the important thing from your perspective, because you're asking for definitions, is that mind does not need necessarily to be conscious. It is conscious in as much as it includes images of the state of your body, which are extremely complex images and are informative of the state of your body. If the images of your body are there, then your mind is also going to be conscious.
Oh, okay. So I was wondering, I know some writers use this image making as the definition of primary or sensory consciousness. But what you're saying is if you only had images of the external world and none of your own body, then you only have mind, but you don't have consciousness.
Exactly. You've got it right. And that's extremely important. And as from your own wording, I see that you sense how different this is from the typical definition.
Right. So I remember in Self Comes to Mind, you said that we needed to add self to mind to get consciousness, but that self is that internal information or feelings.
Exactly. So you could say that in Self Comes to Mind, I was relying too much on the concept of self, although I cannot guarantee exactly what was going on when I was writing it. But the idea is that self was being generated already from feeling. In fact, I know that people normally quote the feeling of what happens as the origin of this idea that feeling is key to consciousness, which is, I have to say, unfortunately, not a very widespread idea. I dare say that the majority of theorizing about consciousness and its origins relies massively on extroception. So there's the world around. I like to say that people are so distracted by the thunder of the world around that they don't realize the world within, and that they wouldn't have a prayer of knowing about the world around if they didn't know first and foremost about the world within. But somehow, when you are distracted by landscapes, visual or auditory, you forget about what's inside.
And there are people who work really hard at ignoring everything that's going on from their inside. I mean, really. Some do that.
Yeah, and they want to shut it down.
I have a question from a listener that relates to the case of the child, without an insula. And he was claiming that somebody wrote that image that I think is in, I can't remember if it's in Self Comes to Mind, but it's in several books, claiming that some people think that patient actually had an insula. And I don't know, I'm not going to read MRIs, but have you had that objection?
No, you sure that's in relation to the insula, not in relation to the amygdala?
No, it was the patient without an insula, still having an emotional life.
Right. One thing that we do know is that, and again, that is very much in the new book, is that feelings do not rely primarily on the cerebral cortex. On the contrary. So you begin this march, this construction of feeling in peripheral nerves, and in peripheral nerves that are in this strong interaction, this incestuous commingling relationship with non-nervous elements. And then you have that in peripheral nerves, you have that in spinal ganglia, for example. You have that in a variety of nuclei in the brainstem. And then eventually you come to the cortex. So the cortex is almost an afterthought feeling. It's being constructed in all of these layers throughout this complicated system. And all the body is feeding into the spinal cord and the brainstem. And eventually, yes, it does come to the cerebral cortex. So a person that does not have insular cortices can have feelings. There is one paper, I can't remember exactly the title. I think it's something like Persistence of Feeling After Damage to the Insular Cortex. I would never want feelings to depend on cerebral cortex alone. On the other hand, if you damage certain nuclei in the brainstem, or if you would have massive damage to the peripheral nervous system as it enters spinal ganglia or brainstem ganglia, then you would have no possibility of feeling, because you would have the way in which we can represent this interaction between body and nervous system would be lost to us.
Well, that makes sense. And I actually have seen, because I did a fellowship in palliative medicine, I took care of a little girl who was probably about 3, who was almost anencephalic. And so I've actually experienced that firsthand, that patient that can have emotions even though they don't have the ability to do things we associate with cortical function. I want to take a moment to remind you about my book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. I released an updated second edition last June, and thanks to listeners like you, it went to number 1 under new releases in neuroscience on Amazon. Are You Sure? Is available both as an ebook and as a paperback from all the major online sellers. But I would love to send you an autograph copy, just email me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com to learn more. The thing that always confuses me, I have to admit, when I read your work is the distinction that you make between feelings and emotion. Would you mind taking us back through that? I think the biggest problem is that a lot of authors use those words differently than you do.
So the difference for me couldn't be more marked. I think of feelings as something that is really in your mind. Feelings are that component of your mind that has a description of the interaction between nervous and non-nervous body elements. So it's all about a representation of a process of life inside you. The vast collection, or the primary collection of feelings, are the feelings that have to do with our homeostatic regulation. So hunger, thirst, well-being, pain, malaise, desire, these are the fundamental feelings that you have available. And we are constantly in the sway of these feelings. They're happening to us all the time in one way or another. Emotions, on the other hand, and I don't think it could be any more different, are about actions. And I think even the word betrays that. The root of the word emotion is about motion directed to the outside. That's exactly what it is. So when you are in fear, you have collections of actions that to the world around betray a state in which you are, in which you have concerns about what is going around, concerns about your security, concerns about your safety, and so forth. So it's about actions. When you are joyful, you laugh out loud, you have a body composition in terms of the actions, in terms of the attributes of your body that are all action related. And they couldn't be more different from the actions that you have if you are depressed. It's a general term that describes all of this phenomenology that has to do with feelings and with emotions and is related to your body and is actually less immediately related to some concrete thought or some concrete way of reasoning.
So where does valence come in?
Well, the valence is a nice or not so nice word to describe a particular color that your feelings may have. By the way, valence, I normally don't use valence, but I don't use valence much, but I normally don't use valence when I'm talking about emotions. I use valence when I'm talking about feelings. And quite frankly, I'm not even very interested in emotions. I'm much more interested in this fundamental process of feeling. And feeling, there are all sorts of things that are very powerful and interesting. There are certain qualities in your feeling, there's certain intensities, and that's when you talk about valence. That's where it makes sense. There's some things that you regard as favorable or unfavorable relative to the state of your life, because that's the compass. All of these things make sense in relation to the state of your life within your body.
You've really explained a lot of this really well. It's actually made some of the questions I was going to ask you unnecessary. So I'm going to give you the hard one.
Okay.
What's your take on the hard problem of consciousness?
Oh, it's so charming. It's a great success in terms of a slogan. David Chalmers is a very intelligent philosopher, and actually sometimes we have very interesting conversations when we're together. And he came up with this idea, I think it was in 94, he came up with this idea that we're not going to have any possibility of explaining this in our lifetime or in anybody's lifetime. I think actually he had a bet of a huge amount of highly expensive French wine that would never be solved. And of course, everybody has been completely obsessed with either proving him right or proving him wrong. So that's the end of it. The way he articulated it, though, has a lot of problems because he basically says the hard problem of consciousness is about the way in which we have to explain how the nervous system, mind you, the nervous system ends up producing something mental, which is non-physical, from something which is very physical, which is the nervous system. And of course, I dislike all aspects of this definition. First, because if we're going to say that mind is mental and non-physical, we're in a bit of problem because I don't see any reason why it is not physical too. Even if we go to the extreme of saying that this is just about the nervous system in operation, and don't take my nuanced view that it is about interactions of the nervous system and the body, the nervous system is physical and the mind is being realized by that structure. And yes, it may be difficult to explain. We may not have all the data that we need, but it does not seem to me at the outset like something that is impossible to explain. I recently read a sentence from a colleague that wrote in a book that there's this veil that will forever separate what is in our minds from what is really in the sensory processes of the brain. When I read this, I heard to myself, I heard the voice of Francis Crick. For many, many years, I worked with him. I listened to him when I was at the Salk Institute. And one would say something like this, and he would look at us and say, really? Just today or yesterday, we had Nobel Prizes in medicine given to some very smart folks here in California that are working the details of how we end up experiencing pain because of certain things that happen in receptors in the nervous system that are, by the way, implanted firmly in the body that holds them. And so we obviously are learning things that we did not know, and we will have to learn many more. But I don't think that declaring things insoluble makes that much sense. We have witnessed this story over and over again. Another set of people that I had great admiration for, the heroes of my time, people like David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel, what they worked on in relation to vision was something that was systematically considered impossible to understand. How are we going to understand that you can have the vision of color and shapes and depth, and we can see landscapes and all of this? And they worked it out. It can be done. Now, it's not easy, and it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of invention, above all. It takes a lot of honing in on a problem and not letting it go sort of doggedly until it gets solved.
Do you know the work of Anil Seth? He's in the UK.
Yes, a little bit. There are a couple of papers that I like very much. A paper that he wrote in, I know the date, 2013, in Trends in Cognitive Sciences that I thought had a very clear view, closely related to mine. Closely related to mine because I think that feeling is critical and that body and life are critical. And that's something that he often quotes. Different because even at that time, I think he was taking a solution that is not completely different, but yes, it is in a way, which has to do with predictive coding, the Friston ideas about how we end up predicting what's in the world around and then making through perception a correction of those predictions rather than the other way around, rather than having everything come bottom up. Well, those ideas are valuable because I think they will have something to say about part of the problem we face. The issue, though, is that you need to decompose the problem. How you feel or how you perceive the outside world are different processes, and how you feel something like pain is not necessarily the same way that you feel something that will have to do with the interior of your body, but not in such an extreme way. And to say that these things are always predictions, if you cut yourself and you have pain, you were not predicting that you were going to have pain. You're not predicting anything. And the value of that information for you as a human being right now is that something happened to you and you're being warned that you need to do something to protect yourself in case there's more of it, and to do something because the wound you have may need to be repaired medically.
One of the things that Anil says that I thought was relevant to what you had said about the hard problem, though, is he just published his first book, and I don't think it's out in the United States yet, but he talks about what he calls the real problem, which is just the practical problem of how does this happen, which I think is interesting because to my mind, he's the next generation. You know, he's in the batch of people who came along after Crick when it's now okay to study consciousness instead of having to buck the it's not studyable dogma. And so it's really, to me, interesting to see what somebody of that generation is saying, because they're building on the work of what has gone before.
You will agree that I have been saying that consciousness is studyable for a long time.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Another person that I've had on the show years ago was Evan Thompson, who worked with those guys from Embodied Cognition. And I've always felt like as soon as you start out early talking about homeostasis, and it seems to me that as soon as there's an inside and an outside, a bacteria even, you've got something subjective. So saying that subjectivity is not explainable doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I think you're quite right.
What do you want to share that I haven't asked you?
That I am full of hope that the continuation of biology as it's being practiced today will give a lot of answers and will make proclamations like the hard problem of consciousness appear to be something from the past. Because I think that we're going to get more and more answers, and the answers are going to be detailed, and they're not going to be sometimes easy to understand, but they will be there, and they will be very satisfactory. And I think that connecting consciousness to feeling, I think, is essential. The fact that this is about life, is about life inside a body, and about regulation of that life, and that feeling is a beautiful development that helps us regulate that life. I think this is absolutely critical. And the other one, I don't like to criticize people, but I have to say that people who just think that they're going to understand consciousness by understanding what's going on in the outside world and the way in which our perceptual systems operate for the outside world have another thing coming, is that they're not going to get it that way.
I always like to ask about advice for students. And in your case, I'd like to talk about, because I get emails about this, students that are trying to decide between medical school and going the PhD route when they're interested in research.
Join the PhD route. I think that medical school is fine. I'm thankful for my career in medicine because the reality of patients with neurological disease is extraordinary, and it taught me a lot. On the other hand, there are specifics of training and there are aspects of modern medicine that are very difficult to accept. And I'm glad that, in a way, it's good to be older, because I practiced medicine at a time in which there was still this idea of the gentlemen of medicine and the gentle ladies of medicine, which is quite interesting. My wife is a physician and neurologist as well, but she's a scientist. She's a neuroimaging expert, but she did a lot of practice in neurology. There was a nobility about it and a way of dealing with patients that was possible. These days, with all of the stuff to do with medical insurance, is absolutely awful. You don't have connection with your physician anymore. It goes through a machinery of bureaucracy that is bad. So if somebody is convinced of his or her capacities in science and is interested in that primarily, go the route of the PhD, and you can do fabulous thing that you can work with the MDs as well. You can do anything you want, provided you're talented and people have goodwill towards you.
I think it really has changed since I made that decision 40 years ago, and I chose to go the MD route. But things have changed so much. Antonio, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you.
It was a great honor to get to talk to Dr. Antonio Damasio after reading his work for so many years. His new book, Knowing and Feeling, is appropriate for readers of all backgrounds. I would love to hear your feedback about this episode or anything else. You can write to me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. And of course, you'll find complete show notes, episode transcripts, and more episodes of Brain Science at brainsciencepodcast.com. Before I review the key ideas from today's interview, I need to share a couple of announcements. First, I have finally finished that handout I promised several months ago. It's called 5 Things You Need to Know About Your Brain. If you want this free handout, all you have to do is sign up for the free Brain Science newsletter. You can use the link in the show notes or text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. That's Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. I've already sent the handout out to current subscribers, so if you missed your copy, just let me know. The main purpose of the newsletter is to provide episode show notes every month so that you don't miss anything. Now I want to take a moment to thank those of you who support my work financially. Brain Science is independently produced and it relies on listeners like you. Usually I just say, please go to brainsciencepodcast.com/donations to learn more. But recently it's become clear that many of you find the current options confusing. I'm working with my web designer, Sue Williams, to fix this problem, but for now I need to take a moment to clarify the options. There are 2 main ways you can help support Brain Science. There's a premium subscription and there's Patreon. Both allow you to cancel at any time. The premium subscription is the best choice for new listeners or anyone else who wants complete access to the entire back catalog of Brain Science, including audio and transcripts. Patreon is the best choice for long-term listeners who don't need access to the back catalog and would like to choose a monthly pledge amount that fits their budget. If you pledge at least $3 a month, you get new episode transcripts, while if you pledge at least $10 a month, you also get ad-free versions of new episodes. I hope this makes it easier for you to choose the plan that fits your needs. And of course, you can still make single donations via PayPal or Venmo at brainsciencepodcast.com/donations. The main idea of Feeling and Knowing by Antonio Damasio is that consciousness is embodied. This means that even though the brain is essential to consciousness or subjective experience, it cannot generate consciousness on its own. You are not a brain in a vat. This is a topic we've actually explored often in the past, but Damasio is definitely one of the pioneers of this viewpoint. Unfortunately, Damasio also uses different terminology than many other writers in the field. Last month, Anil Seth gave us a very simple definition of consciousness, subjective experience. This is a working definition that seems to have emerged with some consensus among current workers in the field. While Damasio's definition is consistent with this approach, he makes a distinction between consciousness and what he calls mind. He says mind is an ongoing collection of images based on neuronal maps. Mind requires a nervous system. Consciousness is mind plus images from the body. Those are the interoceptive feelings coming from the body. Now, based on how ancient and entrenched interoception appears to be, I'm not sure that there's a good example of an animal that clearly has a mind, but is not conscious. I also want to review Damasio's use of the terms emotions and feelings. He says that feelings are the component of the mind generated by the interaction of the body and the nervous system. Examples range from hunger and thirst all the way to well-being and desire. In contrast, he says emotions are actions in the world that betray your state. The example he gives is the difference in behavior between a person who is joyful and one that is depressed. I'm going to skip reviewing his definitions of affect and valence because they don't really have much of a role in his account. The problem is that researchers and writers seem to use the terms emotions and feelings in different, often inconsistent ways. Some use the terms more or less interchangeably, which adds even more to the confusion. In The Neuroscience of Emotion, which I reviewed back in episode 151, Ados and Anderson distinguished between emotions as internal functional states and the conscious experience of emotions, which is what they called feelings. They also argued that emotions cause behavior, not the other way around, as implied by Damasio's definition. In How Emotions Are Made, Lisa Feldman Barrett described affect as a general sense of feeling that is present at birth and depends on interoception. She also called interoception the origin of feelings, but she did not explicitly distinguish between the terms feelings and emotions. Most writers seem to take emotions as something that become feelings when they are consciously experienced. But rather than getting bogged down in terminology, I think it's important to acknowledge the importance of Damasio's key idea, which is that consciousness is an embodied process. This is the essence of the subjectivity of consciousness that is at the heart of the so-called hard problem. Damasio also emphasized that consciousness is rooted in life. That leads us back to Anil Seth and even further back to Evan Thompson's book, Mind in Life. Damasio's unique contribution to the story of consciousness is his insistence that interoception, that is, signals from the body rather than signals from the outside world, is the fundamental component of consciousness. This has important implications for things like artificial intelligence. As many recent guests have pointed out, intelligence does not equal consciousness. Damasio gave us the example of bacteria, which demonstrate intelligent behavior, but they are not conscious. If interoception is the key to consciousness, AI, or artificial intelligence, as it currently exists, is not going to spontaneously become conscious. On a more practical level, the importance of embodiment to consciousness emphasizes its connection to life and warns us not to put our hopes into uploading our brains to the cloud. If you'd like to share your thoughts, please write to me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. You can also post to the Brain Science Podcast fan page on Facebook. Please do share Brain Science with others. It depends on word of mouth to grow. Next month, I'll be talking with David Better, author of On Task, How Our Brains Get Things Done. Until then, I hope you'll listen to my other podcasts, Grain, Rainbows, and Books Ideas. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Brain Science is copyright 2021 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. The theme music for Brain Science is Mindfire, written and performed by Tony Catraccia. You can find his work at syncopationnow.com.